this, I mean, lots of cinematographer friends.
Why poetry? Why did you choose that?
I didn't choose poetry. Poetry chose me. And I was doing my studies in medical college. At a certain, at 17 years, I got admitted a bit early. So I was there. And when I was in second year, then one day I felt that I wrote a poem out of nowhere. I mean, of course, I used to read a lot of literature, for example. Very early in my life, I had read Tolstoy and all, Dostoevsky and all. So I used to read a lot. I used to love reading. And I used to write diaries also. From the age of, let's say, 10. I haven't seen those diaries, I'm sure they must be very childish and all. But I used to love writing. And literature, it was like through words I would understanding the world. Because whatever was happening to me need to be written for me to be understood. That was there in me from very early in my life. But I never decided that I want to be poet or, writer or, short story writer or whatever. At one time in my life, when I was 18-year-old, I suddenly wrote a poem because I heard that poem. So I just wrote it like that, as if it was dictated to me. And that day, I decided that this is what I am born for. And from then on, I lived in a way so that I can continue writing, spending more and more of my time to reading and writing and, working on different arts, etc. But it was not so before that, and it was suddenly that. So that's why I say that I didn't choose it. Poetry chose me. And second thing that I have experienced all my life is that you don't go in search of a poem. You have to live in a way that poem can find you. Of course, your poem can find you. It's not anybody's poem. It's not a object. It's like your poem, you should allow your poem to find you. And that is the way a writer, a poet needs to live. And that's how I lived all my life.
In the view of world literature,
Yeah.
where is Indian poetry right now?
I think if you compare first with European writing, in Europe there is hardly any poetry left. It's in deep crisis. And the reason is that if you mechanize the world that you are living in, everything is mechanized and human relationships also get mechanized. So in Europe, I think the emotional content of the poetry, which I think is the core of poetry, because poetry is an emotional wisdom, a wisdom of emotion. So that has dried to a very great extent. In a sense, one of my Italian poet friend, Stephen Greco, he often tells that culture is dead in Europe. And that's very true for America also. I think our last wonderful poet was John Ashbery. Now he's died. And you have these pockets of few, black poets there. In Europe, I think it's a very, very dismal condition that the poetry is in. But leave aside Japan, I don't think Japanese have great poetry now, except the last one, I think, Shuntaro Tanikawa. He was a wonderful writer, but he died. He's very old. He's very old now. He's hardly writing. I'm sorry, he did die. So, but rest, they are experimenting, of course, day and night, but they are not able to engage in dialogue with their civilization. But like the poetry in Indonesia, poetry in Thailand, poetry in Cambodia, they are much more lively, and so in India also. So I would say that these days, in our times, let's say for last 10 years, 15 years, there's best poetry is written in this area, India, Indonesia, Cambodia. And I'm not partial in that because, I grew up reading René Char and Baudelaire and, John Ashbery, etc., etc. So therefore, I'm not very objectively trying to analyze, For example, I'll tell you that for last 20 years, you will not find one great novel of love coming from Europe. not even a film for that matter, you know. Hardly any poetry of that. European poetry now has become very idea oriented. You know, it's very ideational, something which essays used to do. But even, let's say in France, I think the best poetry is now written in literary theories. Hélène Cixous may be one of the finest, prose writers, but she's a theorist. She writes literary theory or plays. But poetry as such, I don't think this condition is very good. Some, few poets from Russia, I hear, are nice. But otherwise, in Italy, in France, in England, etc., the problem with Asian writers and readers is that we are unnecessarily under awe of these writings. They are very poor, they have nothing to give to us now. You know, they were important earlier in 20th century or just after Second World War.
Your brother Ashok Vajpeyi is one of the well-known poets from India.
Yes.
Would you share with us, your moments with your brother, something?
My brother, I'm 21 years younger to him. So it's a huge difference, you know. So when I started writing, when I was growing up, he was not in the city that I come from, Sagar, which has a university. It's a university town. So he was already in Delhi. And then, he used to come sometimes to Sagar, and we were very little. I was very little. So he was like an imaginary human being for me. He's an imaginary brother for me for very long. Then I went to Bhopal to study medicine. Then I stayed with him, and those days where he was making institution, Bharat Bhavan. But that was underway, so he was very busy. And for me, Bhopal was too big a city because I'd gone from a very small town. It's like Oxford, Sagar, the only university and very little town around it. So once again, there was an estrangement for me in that city, and he was busy, so we could hardly have any dialogue. So our relationship developed only after I started writing. And in fact, because by then I was very close to Mani Kaul, was very close to another teacher of mine, who is Nirmal Verma, who is a great novelist, and another is J. Swaminathan, who is a painter. So my, closer relationship to culture or to arts was with these three teachers of mine, rather than to my brother. And when I grew up further, I finished my studies, started doing a job of teaching in the college, then of course we would start having our dialogues together, but all through both of us maintained our own integrities. I never presented in Bhopal as his brother, I presented myself and lived as an independent, writer who can be judged or critiqued on the basis of his qualities of his work, the qualities of his work, rather than his being related to somebody. So, because that was very necessary for my growth as a writer. So, we grew up like that, but at a certain point, because I was writing for a magazine of Bharat Bhavan, 2 or 3 of my friends were working in that magazine. It was a very important magazine called Purvagrah, which is The Prejudice. That's the name of the magazine. So I was writing for that magazine for my friends, because they were very close to me. So, and he was the editor. But I was never giving my works to him, but to my friends, So that's how, but then later we developed very close friendship. Now, more than brothers, we are very close friends.
When did you bud this interest in filmmaking?
Yeah. It so happened that when I joined Medical College in Bhopal, Mani Kaul was making Satya Se Uthta Aadmi, a film on the poet Mukti Bodh. So he was in Bhopal, and Mani was a very charismatic person, intellectually and artistically. And he was somebody who could, the way he talked and the way he addressed your innermost soul was almost like a dream. So, of course, I had seen his films. And it's very strange that when I was a little child, let's say 10 year, 12 year, I was very afraid of going to see a commercial film. Because there's lots of violence and all that. I couldn't see those films. But in between that, in film club, I had seen Uski Roti, Bunny's first film. And I really liked it. And when people were making fun of that, that's one quality of the half-literate people about cinema, that they feel that it's for entertainment. They think the same for poetry also. But then when I met Mani, and it so happened that I read out to him my poems, my early poems. He was one of those early readers, a great man reader type. So I showed him my poems, I read out to him. He spoke for 2 hours on my poems that day, that evening. Because he had come to Bhopal to establish a center for music, Drupad, and he was there for a while and making a film, Sabir Singh Tal. And then when I was talking to him gradually, so I gradually started understanding the fine elements of cinema, along with, of course, poetry and painting and all. So I gradually, came very close to cinema. And then, of course, I came in contact with a lot of filmmakers also, and lots of cinema also. And like, for example, I got to see Bresson, and I loved his cinema.
Your poems have been translated in Bengali.
Yes.
How important is translation in literature?
I'll start by saying that we must first understand that translation is an impossible act. Right? Now, in this impossibility, we attempt to do something possible. First thing is that because when you translate, you cannot bring that music into other language. That's impossibility. So first thing is that it's impossible. But then after having accepted that, then you start doing it. So one thing which is very interesting for me is that when it comes in another language, let's say it has come in Bengali or in French or in Swedish, whatever, then suddenly what happens is that your poem becomes kind of distant from you. It goes slightly away from you. And it has a pleasure and also the anxiety of something very intimate going away from you. But if it goes away, it acquires a certain freedom also. So when a translated poem goes away from a writer, or from me for that matter, my poems in original also become a little more free. They also get more detached from me, number one. And number two, that I hear other language, my poem in other music. So it is as if a new music is given to those lines, to those emotions, or to those ideas. In fact, in poetry, the idea and emotion are not two things. They are, dimensions of one thing. And this is just for understanding that you say this is emotion, this is thought, this is nonsense, there's no division exists. So in poetry, the poetic experience then undergoes a certain transformation in translation. Of course, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't understand most of the languages into which my poems are translated. So when my poems are being read in another translation that somebody read yesterday evening also in Bengali translation, for me it's a new sound, it's a new music of that language. That gives me pleasure, but that's all.
So what would you say to the young writers?
I've actually, all my life, I've never given suggestion to anybody else, but if at all, if I take myself as an example, I would say that you should read widely, you should interact with the other art forms, you should try and know the traditions of India, of your area, of your localities, because you must understand, young writers must understand that poetry develops as a dialogue with the civilization that you belong to. If you cannot develop a dialogue with your civilization, if you are only creating a kind of object made of words, then it's worthless. All great poems in the world developed as a dialogue with the civilization. And unfortunately, our education system doesn't allow you to know this civilization deeply. Which means you should talk, for educating yourself, you should talk to enough number of people, all kinds of people, like artisans also, to different kinds of pundits. Don't have prejudice about, that, they are illiterate or they are uneducated, etc., etc. And you should be very humble for the reason because you do not know civilizations, depths and its intricacies. Because we do not know that, therefore it's on us, the onus is on us writers to go and understand it, to give power to our writing. If we do not engage in dialogue with our civilization, like people like Dostoevsky did, like Tolstoy did, like Chekhov did, like Baudelaire did. You cannot imagine, for example, Baudelaire without French tradition. You cannot imagine René Char without French tradition. You cannot imagine T.S. Eliot without British tradition. And so therefore, or Shankhoda without, Shankho Ghosh without Bengali and wider Indian traditions, So this deep understanding of your civilization forms the core of poetry along with your personal experiences of it. Number one. Number two, write with courage. And what does that mean? Whatever you feel is poetry for you. Whether it's in prose, whether it's in well metered verses, but whatever that you think is poetry for you, write it like that. You will be rejected. If you are rejected, that's the biggest award that you can get. If you write a poem which gets rejected by major critics and all, number of critics, then do think that you are doing something very new. And so start having greater belief in your work. And lastly, be very curious to the works of your contemporaries. Of course, when you try to understand the tradition, your civilization, you will read your elders, your senior writers, your ancestral writers and all that. That is all right. But be very humble to your contemporaries. Most of the time, the young writers are very brutal to their contemporaries. Why? Because they are unsure of their position. And so therefore they feel that if there are too many good writers, there will be hardly any place for them. But believe me, normally there are never too many writers. And if there are, the bench of literature is an expanding one. If there are 20 good writers in a language, then there will be place for 20. If there are 2,000 good writers in a language, there will be space enough in that language for 2,000 good writers.